The 20th anniversary of Doctor Who was the last great celebration of the classic era. By the time the 25th had rolled around, the circumstances had very much changed, and Doctor Who was a show hovering over the edge, an edge it had fallen over long before anyone was thinking about the 30th. This was therefore the last time Doctor Who could celebrate itself while its original iteration was still on the air. And therefore it's important to appreciate the Five Doctors for what it is. A quite unique celebration of a show that was a long runner but had no taste of what the run coming to an end might be like, and it would get very shortly. It is also perhaps quite typical of 80s Who, is more interested in celebrating the past than the future, compared to the Daily Doctor, which was more about using the past to move forward with the show and be about the future just as much as what had come before, while the Five Doctors is perfectly happy with the past, thank you. And that is a perfectly valid approach and probably the right one for the time, but does somewhat limit the storytelling potential. The episode becomes just an exercise in member berries, which was perhaps more fun to an audience in 1983 looking to celebrate their show long before the internet, than it is now in 2025 when everyone is sick to fucking death of nostalgia being a substitute for quality. Now, that's not to say that The Five Doctors is bad, it certainly has its moments, and yes, reality hamstrings it a little. After all, out of the promised 5 Doctors, we actually get 3, but unless they're planning to use necromancy to bring back William Hartnell, they were going to need to recast the first Doctor, and Tom Baker not wanting to return, perhaps understandably after having spent 2 years away from a role he spent 7 years defining, meant the 4th Doctor's role was always going to be peripheral, and there was nothing anyone could do about that. You couldn't avoid it, and we'll get to what effect it has, but it also has reality going for it in a lot of ways. Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee are delight to see back and slip back into the roles effortlessly, and Peter Davison is wisely put into the central role that holds everything together and becomes the leading man in the piece equally effortlessly. These were the important factors to get right, the ones within their control, and using the 3 Doctors they actually had was the important thing to do properly. In this, therefore, the episode achieves what it set out to do, be a celebration and show us all the old things we want to see. It's unfortunate, therefore, that the weakness of the episode is in the fundamental storytelling and how it is frankly just not very good. It doesn't have a particularly interesting plot, nothing really to say about any of the characters or themes, it basically has nothing interesting to say and doesn't say that in a particularly interesting way itself. Now, you could perhaps argue that wasn't the point, that we're here to have a celebratory slap around and that's it, but it's not like this is the standard for anniversary specials. The 3 Doctors 10 years before and the Day of the Doctors 30 years later both managed to tell at least somewhat interesting stories of their own, with the extra Doctors and celebratory stuff being a setting and addition rather than the entire story like it is here. I suppose I'm looking at this not just because it's around the time of the 62nd anniversary, but also because I'm continuing the theme of looking at the development of the lore of the Doctor Who and the history of the Time Lords in particular. But honestly, in that case, I'm not sure I really should have bothered. For all its bluster, we find out precious little about the Time Lords as a people, just some generic barbaric past with the Death Zone and all about Rassilon as a person. But not very much, and it's contradicted by later material anyway. I mean, here he doesn't look like a vengeful, angry Timothy Dalton, does he? So in the end, we learn and grow nothing. Not doing great so far, are we? But am I being unfair? Yes, probably. In the end, there's a bit of old fun and nothing more, and that suited the occasion. But I have to be honest with you how genuinely I find this episode. Enjoyable, but extremely flawed in quite frustrating ways. Let's start at the beginning, usually a good place to start, with the production of the piece. This episode was directed by Peter Moffat. With a second name like that, it seems we're already off to a bad start. Anyway, Moffat was, it's fair to say, not one of the more innovative directors at the time, and I think it's honestly the best example of a director who treated TV, and Doctor Who in particular, like a film stage play rather than a dynamic medium of its own. If at one end of the scale you're Graham Harper and Peter Grimwade, Moffat was very much at the other end, and this episode is a prime example of how ineffective this approach could be. It's competent, there's nothing wrong with it per se. It's just boring, and undynamic, and dull. Something particularly interesting about it, and I think Moffat honestly fails to meet the occasion. He treats it as another Doctor Who episode, and with his approach that means we just film the occasion with very little of interest. Again, I'm not saying it's incompetent or bad. There are a few nice shots here and there, and the pacing isn't bad. I'm not saying it's like the story itself ever becomes boring, it's just the directing job is film what's going on, that's it, and yeah, it might occasionally show a shot of a hand placing a model on a stage to be all mysterious, or a shadow of a Dalek to be all mysterious, but it's very much in service of the plot and not any kind of stylism. I don't know, perhaps I'm being too harsh, but it was a feeling watching this of total indifference to what was on the screen because of how it was presented that maybe I'm not explaining very well, but what is on the screen is just dull, there's no urgency or danger, and I'm disappointed as a result, I have to say. The rest of the production is a mixed bag. The location scouting is not bad, but it's used poorly. Sometimes it looks like this desolate zone of destruction it's meant to be, and sometimes we see Bessie drive by, a fairly pleasant looking lake that would be nice to sit by on a summer's day, that sort of defeats that feeling. But I do like certain elements of production design. The Citadel, Dark Tower, whatever the bloody hell it's called. Its interior does have a suitable level of grandeur and spookiness, and despite its simplicity, I think the Raston Warrior robot is a rather beautiful creation, for instance, so in the end, swings and roundabouts. The best part of it though is the soundtrack, which is really effective, distinctive and unique without becoming farcical, but overall the production of it just feels off, like nobody quite knew what to do with it, and I suppose that's a theme that carries into the script. I suppose the script delivers exactly what it was intended to do, and I think my antipathy towards it might be the fact I'm approaching it wrong. I freely admit that, and I do very much intend to talk about what this episode does right, of which there is much, and it would be unfair to suggest otherwise. This episode was written by Terrance, who was of course a legend of the series and wrote many an impressive story in his time, so I'm not going to suggest there's some kind of fault with him as a writer overall. I also think an old-timer like Dix, or Robert Holmes, who was the original choice before his storyline fell through, was the right choice, as you needed someone who understood the show and the elements of its past that were being harked back to in the first place. And I think that's the part where the elements are done right. And, well, it could have been worse, thank goodness it wasn't The Five Doctors by Terrance Dudley or something. Anyway, I do think there are things done right with this, and I think the most important thing to look at is to see what was done right, and what isn't, is all five Doctors. So let's see them one by one. The first Doctor was of course always going to be a tricky one to pull off for this, for the obvious reason that William Hartnell had died in 1975. I do suspect if Tom Baker had decided to appear, it would have been the first Doctor who would have been quietly shunted to the side through the use of stock footage, but as they weren't going to have the fourth Doctor and they could hardly do the five Doctors with just three, the first Doctor was going to have to play a major role, so that meant recasting. And recast they did, with Richard Hurndall taking on the role, and Hartnell paid tribute to with the "One Day I Will Come Back" clip from the Dalek invasion of Earth opening up proceedings. Hurndall certainly does look like Hartnell, but I think my assessment of his performance is mixed. I think this is the first time the Trap, this counting three Doctors where his appearance was too limited for it to really matter, was fallen into with the first Doctor where he becomes entirely caricature. He's a gruff, authoritative, grumpy old man who goes around being rude to everyone. Is what the caricature is, and well, it definitely carried over into New Who, where we got Twice Upon a Time where he was only that. And anyone who's actually watched the first Doctor's era can tell you that's only the surface of it. He's also crafty and sometimes devious, and often quite mischievous and joyful, and does genuinely care about the people around him, all depending on who was bringing what out of him, and it worked magnificently, especially with Hartnell, how Hartnell portrayed it. And this has been a problem with basically every reinterpretation of the first Doctor since. I think it's fairly obvious this was the only returning Dr. Dix had never written before, and he just doesn't quite know how to do it right. It also adds to the feeling of blandness that pervades the entire episode. The Doctor's reaction to seeing Susan again, something we literally saw at the beginning of this episode in the Hartnell clip that would mean so much to this Doctor, is mild surprise, and that's about it. Hurndall does a good impression of Hartnell, but that's all it is. The spark in the eyes that made Hartnell's performance so special just isn't there. I'm not suggesting this is entirely a problem with recasting as a concept. Say what you want about Twice Upon a Time, but David Bradley does manage to bring his own unique interpretation to the first Doctor, while also harking back to what made Hartnell's performance so special in his own unique way. Now, I don't blame Hurndall for not really achieving that here. I think the material just wasn't really in the script, and the directing probably finished it off, but it leaves the performance just a bit directionless. Even when the first Doctor does get a moment of genius, when he realises they need to leave Barusa to it, to his dealings with Rassilon, it just feels a little flat and empty, more so than it should. Overall, I'm not hugely impressed. Yes, they were dealt a bad hand with not having the original actor, but I think they hamstrung themselves with how it was written. Fortunately, things pick up for the other Doctors. The second Doctor, well, it's like he never left, really. Much of that is Patrick Troughton, of course, who is as magnificent as ever. The brilliant subtleties in performance are as alive as ever, and I think pairing him up with the Brigadier was a good move, as he bounces off Nicholas Courtney very well. Although I suppose that was directed by events, they had to have Sarah Jane with the third Doctor, so the Brigadier couldn't be with the third Doctor, etc. and so forth, but never mind. And while there's just little Troughton-esque moments here and there, aren't there? My favourite is when Rassilon offers immortality to the Doctors. He quickly finds his way to hide behind Pertwee, just a brilliant moment. It works well on the page too. He's quick-witted and bouncy, but also serious and solemn when he needs to be, going between the two just as the second Doctor always did. He pokes fun at his other incarnations. When the chips are really down, he means business just as much as the others. It's classic second Doctor, and you can tell Dix knew exactly what he was doing with him, and you can tell Troughton knew exactly how to slip back into the role. It's much the same with the third Doctor, who obviously Dix was very much in his wheelhouse writing for. While I think it's a shame the story doesn't provide him for an authority figure to get mad at, and was always the third Doctor's highlight, he makes up for it by being proactive, determined, headstrong, all that we love to see from this Doctor, and Pertwee obviously walks back out into the role like he never left it. I don't actually have that much to say about him, or indeed the second Doctor. They're brought in just as they were during their times on the show, and the best thing you can do with returning Doctors is make it seem that they never left, and that's what they do. The only thing I'd really say is that the structure of the episode means they don't have that much to do, but that's a wider plot issue, and we'll get to that kind of thing. Then, of course, the fourth Doctor, who is not appearing in this film in this episode. As I said, I understand why Tom Baker might have been reluctant to return, given how little time had elapsed since his departure from the role, in circumstances that can't have been brilliant for him, and this left the creators of the episode a rather unavoidable problem. Indeed, the fact that this is really the fourth Doctor, the four Doctors, is often commented upon, but to be honest, I think the solution they had was really the best they were going to be able to do. Take some footage from Sharda, at that point completely unseen by the public, and it's easy to take for granted given the completed footage has been available for us for yonks, but this was totally new for an audience in 1983, and then come up with an excuse similar to that used for Hartnell in The Three Doctors. Stuck in a time thingy-majig. To Dix's credit, he at least tries to make this an important part of the plot, with the fourth Doctor being stuck doing something to Bruce's plan. I don't know, the problem is it's a bunch of technobabble nonsense as a whole, and this doesn't help much, but it's a nice idea all the same. So I conceded nothing really to do with this, and I think they did the best they could as a result. Finally, there's the Fifth Doctor, and I think the role of the incumbent Doctor is often an underrated one in multi-Doctor stories, but it really is, in a lot of ways, the glue that holds everything together. It has to have them as the main spearhead of the piece, it is still their show after all. The Five Doctors succeeds at this without a doubt. The Fifth Doctor is the leading man of the piece, while the others trundle through returning plot elements. The Fifth Doctor is the one engaging with the plot, solving mysteries of the story, and engaging with the important side characters of the piece. It's nice that the Doctor is shown as far more wily and far more heroic than any other Time Lords, reinforcing the only theme of the piece, which is the Doctor's independence and rebellious streak, and it's through the Fifth Doctor's actions and investigations that we get a sense of this. I think my only real criticism is that it takes far too long to get to this point. I'm not really sure we need the Doctor zoning in and out of existence, only for him to then stop doing so, and then to get transported to the capital after dry exposition with the First Doctor, but again, it's indicative of the problems of the approach rather than the work with this Doctor himself. And I really do like the ending, actually. The Doctor zooming off away from Gallifrey and the Presidency is of course within character, but it's the glee with which the Fifth Doctor does it. This much calmer, more accommodating incarnation is still doing that because any Doctor would. It's such an important part of who he is. I like that. Overall, I think a good job is done with the Fifth Doctor. So the leading men are mostly got right, with one or two issues here or there, and that helps enormously in making the episode both enjoyable and watchable enough, and create the necessary celebratory atmosphere. After all, we're here to see the Five Doctors and celebrate the history of Doctor Who through its Five Doctors. And while only we really get three, we can appreciate that's due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. And what we do really gets across is what this is meant to be. On this basis alone, this succeeds, and we get the great feeling of seeing our beloved show celebrated by the people that made it happen. There are other things this does right. I think one of its most important is one of its major villains, the Master. The Anthony Ainley Master frequently was not used very well throughout the 80s, mostly because JNT was a blithering idiot who thought we needed to be a moustache twirling, or beard twirling in this case, villain, which meant Ainley was usually pushed into over-the-top performances he wasn't very fond of or comfortable doing. Occasionally, though, he was allowed to be more subtle, and here he does very well, helped by Dick's writing it with rather more to him than he usually got. No doubt writing as if he was writing for Delgado's Master, but never mind. The Master here is very multifaceted, and it's his relationship with the Doctor that's the centre of his story. When he's called in by the Time Lords to go help him, he says a universe without the Doctor is scarcely worth thinking about, and the audience is given the chance to interpret this themselves. Is a sarcastic response belying his intention to bury the Doctor first chance he gets, or indeed some kind of twisted affection? Or indeed when he offers help to the Doctor, is it a genuine offer, or an attempt to get into a position to benefit himself, or simply desperation in order to get his grubby mitts on those extra regenerations the Time Lords are promising him? And when he finally snaps and turns on the Doctor, is that genuine irritation at the Doctor being so dismissive of him, or his plan all along? Etc. and so forth, those aren't the only examples. Point is, we're allowed to see the layers of the Master, all the competing motivations and how they all play back to his relationship with the Doctor. Ainley handles all of this very well, with the usual suaveness tempered by those competing motivations. Is the Master about as interesting as he ever managed during the 5th and 6th Doctor's eras, as unless next time he was back to beard twirling and it wasn't until Survival that we really got to see him do his best. But again, it's in the spirit of the celebration, exploring the Doctor's relationship with his best enemy, and I think it's handled very well. And indeed him being foiled by the Brigadier smacking me in the face is very much in that spirit too. Some of the general world building isn't bad either. Rassilon being shown to be this rather clever manipulator with a shocking ruthless streak, building on the previous establishment of him as the founder of Time Lord Society, and perhaps a sign of why Time Lord Society is not as peachy as originally thought. But nevertheless, we're allowed to think, is this in service of Gallifrey, by trapping those who would be dictators like Barusa, or perhaps in his own service to trap those ambitious enough to challenge him? We're allowed to think, and I like that. As I said earlier, it's a pity Rassilon basically became a blank slate after this, especially in New Who, but we can't expect consistency forever, can we? The idea of Gallifrey having a shameful past is a good idea as well, although woefully underexplored and doesn't make much sense, but oh well. In general, there are some good ideas, but just doesn't get the development it needs. I also like a lot of the ideas that are there to serve the plot, but nevertheless make sense. It's a nice bit of thinking, for instance, to have the Death Zone as an excuse, to have a Dalek and some Cybermen, the things the fans will want to see, but without it become a playing of action figures sort of thing. A good reason for them to be there so they can be there to celebrate the anniversary, but also not make the plot feel forced. That I like, it's taking something you need to do and wrapping the story around it. But I think all of that perhaps misses the point. This is meant to be a celebration of 20 years of Doctor Who, and is that enough? Well, maybe not, but there's no denying what it does in service of that it does very well. There's enough member berries to put a smile on the face of any fan, and while we get sick of this sort of thing these days when it's become the basis of pretty much all the storytelling in long-running franchises like this, back then it was far more of a novelty and something to show the fans that the show they love so much meant as much to those who made it as to those watching it, and that 20 years was indeed a milestone worth celebrating. And that it does very well. Whatever other flaws it has, it can't be taken away if it succeeds at this. Unfortunately, this leads us into said flaws. Firstly, while the episode does very well with its doctors, I think that can't really be said about its companions. Maybe it's understandable, you've already got 4 doctors to juggle around, there's only so much time, but even so, most of the companions in this feel like generic cutouts, which is not the case for their actual characters when they were on the show. The best use is the Brigadier, who gets his usual acerbic wit across quite well, and Nicholas Courtney is of course wonderful as always. But in the end, this appearance lives in the shadow of his far more successful exploration just a few stories earlier in Mordred Undead, and it's difficult to see what this episode can say about that story didn't. Sarah Jane Smith feels like she's just here because she's the most popular companion. Sladen does very well, but she doesn't have really much time to say or do anything, which is a shame considering how proactive Sarah could actually be in her time on the show. And for everyone else, well, I'm afraid it's just dry exposition and not really exploring anything. Well, I say that, the most successful companion appearances are actually the cameos in the Dark Tower, or whatever it's called. The Third Doctor sees Liz and Mike Yates, a callback to the familiarity of the Third Doctor's time, a way of these to show how these hallucinations are manipulating him. And it's Jamie and Zoe the Second Doctor sees, using his regret about how they left him, but then using that same regret that he's able to see through the manipulation. And yes, it's because of this episode definitely canonises Season 6B. It's literally impossible to deny it unless you're an idiot. Which definitely the time finds the people who made the war games in colour, but never mind. And in the end, those cameos are a great way of exploring characters, so I'll give them that. But alas, we don't see the same with the actual companions who are actually in the piece. Caroline Ford is trying, but she has no chemistry with Hurndall, and that sells their relationship short, and Susan as a whole has very little to do. She spends most of the second half of the episode with Turlough and the TARDIS looking worried about a Cybermen's bomb. What happens with her being paired up with Turlough? What does that mean about either of their characters and how they react to things? Nothing. It's just a distraction for some dry exposition, surprise surprise, and that's it. I guess the companion with the most personality in all this is Tegan, but that's because she's so well established by this point that she slots into proceedings so naturally, and her forceful personality is quite a good fit for all the doctors around her doing his exposition to push the plot forward, but even then this is hardly an outing where she's given a lot of depth, and that kind of belies the whole approach. These people are just here because we know them and we remember them, or in the case of Tegan and Turlough, because they literally have to be as they were the incumbent companions. It feels like there's no room for them in the script, which is bollocks frankly, because there's stuff they should be doing, even if only a few bits here and there. You wouldn't even need any extra time. I don't know, perhaps Susan and Turlough are able to escape because Susan, as a Time Lord herself, is able to get the TARDIS working using Turlough's intelligence and skills to help her, using their positive traits, and you wouldn't need any extra time, you just have to cut the shots of them looking worried and talking about this cyber bomb. But we don't get that, and most of the companions just get nothing to do other than, as I said, dry exposition. This belies the problem with the whole approach, though. That is honestly quite a flat, dull, underdeveloped outing. The ideas I said earlier get no real development, and the plot itself is quite weak, based entirely on dry exposition and technobabble. We get no real sense that there's an underlying theme, aside from that the Doctor's character I mentioned earlier, but that's about it really. The whole thing feels like an exercise in nothing. The plot moves obediently from point to point, very matter-of-factly. We see all the Doctors with the same goal in mind, and reaching that goal, again, very matter-of-factly. It's just not deep or interesting enough, and I've said this, that's maybe beyond the point of a celebratory bash, but the other anniversary specials have managed it, as I said. The Three Doctors was certainly about more than just bringing them together, it was about the story of Omega and how that related to Doctor, and the Doctor was very much a chance to explore the future as well as the past by looking at how it affected our main character. This episode doesn't manage that, maybe because there's too many Doctors to really use effectively, maybe not. But it just feels lifeless sometimes. And that is only occasionally interjected by cool scenes. The Rastan Warrior robot is extremely cool, but what does it add to proceedings beyond being cool? And yeah, perhaps a bit of a preview of New Who there, but never mind. I can't really dwell on this because there are only so many ways to say something that is flat and dull. So it's flat and dull, I hope that got across. In nothing is this more aptly demonstrated than in the portrayal of the Time Lords, which even gives Arc of Infinity a run for its money in dull blandness. The thing is, if you're going to set a story on Gallifrey, you need to be willing to explore the Time Lords, and while the ideas are there, wrestle on the Death Zone, the execution is just poor. The Death Zone is a thing in the Time Lords past because it was, and they're ashamed of it now because they say so in, you guessed it, dry exposition. And that's about it really. We don't get a sense of how deep in its society it is and what their true thoughts on it now, whether there's any elements of society that rule abandoning it or stuff like that. We don't get a sense of the shades in Time Lord society that should have been the case here. It frankly feels like a plot convenience and nothing else when it shouldn't have done. It's an opportunity to find out more about the Time Lords and their past, in a way that shows how, I don't know, they might have changed as well, but indeed shed light on how they're more like that now than they care to admit to. All of that, but no. And oh my god, the boredom of these characters. Chancellor Flavia is about as dull as it's possible for a Time Lord to get, as though essentially has any dimensions at all. Never mind she's actually got any Time Lord or even human traits that would have added any 3 dimensions to her, frankly. And the Castellans know not the Mind Probe.
What? No, not the Mind Probe.
Yes, thank you. It gets memed all the time, rightly so, because it's memeable, but I get the feeling like, how else was the character supposed to say it? Do we have anything we know about how this Castellan would inform how he'd react to this situation and that threat? And he's appeared before. He was in Arc of Infinity, and admittedly fuck all was done with him there too, but it just belies how little thought is really going into it. Which leads us to the crowning fail of how this episode mishandles these things, Barusa. Barusa as a character has become progressively weaker over time. The complex, intriguing voice of authority and the deadly assassin, whose relationship with the Doctor could be gleaned from just a few words, to the less authoritative but nevertheless interesting mentor figure for the Doctor in the Invasion of Time, to a dull, pompous windbag in Arc of Infinity, to a dull, pompous wingbag who also happens to be a bad guy in this episode. How anyone thought this was a good idea, I don't know, but turning Barusa into a bad guy just goes against everything the character was established to be. Pompous and over the top perhaps, but loyal to Gallifrey to a T, and someone who genuinely appreciated the Doctor even if he'd rarely admit as such. And Belias, even in a lesser story like the Invasion of Time, showed how much there was to him. In this episode he just becomes a generic baddie. Making a baddie at all goes against the character that previously been established of course, but it was a terrible idea full stop. Apparently Dix decided on him as the villain because it was the least obvious thing to do. Yes, of course it was the least obvious thing to do. Why would you make this fascinating mentor character for the Doctor a baddie for no good reason? Oh, and speaking of which, the reason is just criminally absurd. Yes, it's that old chestnut again. He just wants power, to rule forever and be immortal. I cannot fathom a reason so generic given to a character that it did not fit at all. I can only imagine about 10 seconds thought went into this, and frankly the payoff is not at all worth it. While we get a bit out of Rassilon's trap, which I said was okay, the message is kind of weak. Don't be immortal, it's a trap, although one that entirely exists within the context of the story, so has no real meaning for the audience, so never mind. And his end doesn't feel cathartic or deserved because this has come out of nowhere for this character. So, I have to ask the question again of which is more important. The celebratory spirit of the piece, putting the anniversary first and foremost and enjoying it as a result, or the overall quite weak storytelling if I have to be honest. And it's difficult, but the former is effective no doubt, but it should not have been at the expense of the latter, and there's no reason to imagine that it needed to be. The other anniversary specials did it fine, and I think suggesting the format of this particular one, with so much to include, was perhaps a suggestion the production team, or indeed even Dix the writer, bit off maybe a bit more than they could chew with it. And yet, it's still a fun enough time, it's worth it to see Troughton and Pertwee back, and it certainly has its moments, although some of them only come in a special edition. You have no idea how annoying it is to hear about the game of Rassilon, rather than the game of Rassilon, but never mind there. Overall, as an anniversary special, I think honestly it's a triumph, going through the adversity and having only 3 out of the 5 requisite Doctors, and still making a satisfying and enjoyable special. As an actual episode, honestly it's not great, and I think it has to be up to the individual viewer whether A is more important than B, and therefore whether this was successful or not. So with all that in mind, I'm giving this one a final score of 4 out of 10. It's slightly below Classic Who's usual standards. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, even if it has bad parts, and it does its main job and presents a watchable and enjoyable experience as a result. But Classic Who is usually better than this, with cleverer, better developed stories and characters, and even considering its provenance, this episode does fall short of that standard. It's not bad, but it does disappoint in a few key ways, and therefore it's below the average that Classic Who usually manages. Well, next time Ballora the series in Gallifrey comes up again will be in The Trial of a Time Lord, which I will be looking at next year to celebrate that story's 40th anniversary. Until then, there'll be reviews on other Doctor Who stories. What? Well, I suppose you'll find out, won't you? And so will I, as I haven't really decided any of them, but never mind that. See you then.